So we're live in the Irish Whiskey Lock-In. It's Friday. It's time for a whiskey. If it wasn't already time for a whiskey before, it's definitely time for one now. Delighted to be hanging out on a Friday drinking whiskey with Irish whiskey fans. Delighted to see so many of you already watching, tuned in. Paul, Stacey, Ed, Peter, Jeff. Brilliant. Great to see you all here so early. Shane is here from Cleveland. Good man, Shane. Great to see you. So we're going to taste three great whiskies tonight. And for the first time, I thought we'd bring somebody in, an expert, because everyone knows I'm no expert. We'll bring in the right people to talk about Irish whiskies. We're going to bring in Conor Ryan in about 10 minutes or so, once we get up and running. And Conor's the global spirits ambassador for Pearse Irish Whiskey and Pearse Lyons Distillery. And Conor's going to talk us through these two whiskies that are part of the lineup at the Pearse Lyons Distillery. And he's got some great stories, great history. Conor's a fellow Cork man, which is always a good thing to have in the house. And then we're going to probably finish off with some Redbreast small batch here. I've got batch D, which we'll sip on later on. But delighted to see everybody here. I'm sure everybody is getting weary of all these live streams and podcasts and videos by now. I see so many of them, but it is great to see so many whiskey brands and bloggers and magazines all utilizing technology in ways that they never did before. And it's really opening up the ability for brands and for individuals to connect in ways they never did before. So I've been watching some great distillery live streams. I just got off watching the live stream with Whiskey Cast, the whiskey podcast. Billy Lighton, the master blender from Middleton Distillery, was part of that, as were two other master blenders. So it's great to see so much interest and so many people turning out for Irish whiskey and for whiskey generally through live streams when we're all stuck at home. So wherever you're tuning in from, as always, let me know where you are in the comments, what you're drinking. There's Eric Flynn. Good man, Eric. Eric, I saw your Facebook message earlier. I'll get back to you. Stacey's here. Greg, Joe Moore. Good man, Joe. Joe's hopping off one virtual whiskey tasting onto another. That's the way to do it. I think we're all doing that actually at the moment, aren't we? Peter says that he's learning a lot with all these live streams. Yeah, I am too. It's fantastic to get up close with so many of the whiskey makers. You know, it's often very difficult to spend time with people whose time is in such demand. But now with live streams, with Instagram Live and Zoom and Facebook, we're able to get up close and hear from the blenders, the distillers, the merchants about their whiskies, about their process, and ask them questions, which is a fantastic thing for us. Renee and Ron are tuning in from Columbus. Melinda says hi as well, Renee. Great to see you and Ron joining in. Paul is here from Shannon. Brendan O'Reilly, Dicey's in Donegal. Good man, Brendan. MP is here from Minnesota. You're tasting Jameson Bold, Round and Lively with Redbreast Cask Strength, batch 117. Good man, MP. Let me see who else have we got here. Oh, good man, David's here from DC. Great to see you, David. And great, Gavin has got his Pearse 5-year-old at the moment as well. Yeah, so it's great to see people actually grabbing the whiskies that are going to be on these streams, those whiskies that you do have, of course, and bringing them with you to the tasting, because I think it adds to the kind of the community feel of we're all going through this together, we're all drinking this together. Last night we had a great old time. We had almost 150 people on a Zoom video conference where you could see faces and you could see each other. There was 150 of us almost, and we did a live Jameson virtual tasting experience for Ohio, for residents of Ohio. So we teamed up with the Jameson team in Ohio, and it was fantastic because prior to the kickoff of the tasting, attendees were sending me pictures of the 4 Jameson whiskies that they had bought in advance of the tasting, or pulled out of the cupboard 1 or 2 of the bottles that they'd had on standby, and they were tasting them along with us. So that's great to see. So if anyone's ever got these bottles or these whiskies, I always publish, or I'll post a picture of the whiskies we're drinking normally on the Thursday before the live stream, and that way it gives you a chance to maybe get hold of one of these whiskies or pull it out of your cupboard, which is great. Who else have we got joining? Oh, we got Ned Gahan there from Waterford Distillery. Good man, Ned. We're looking forward to seeing what's coming out of Waterford very soon. Great visit down with Ned and the team there a few months ago. Richard's joining us. He was on the Whiskey Cast feed as well. He's on to some Dargaelic Bluebell tree number 3. Good man, Richard. Great to see you. Brian Redden in Cincinnati is here. This is brilliant. Great to see so many people. It was 70 of us here now at the moment, all raising a glass. Well, there's Mark Bergen, Whiskey or Whiskey, from Twitter. Good man, Mark. Mark is the first man was the first person to show me the Pearse Lyons distillery in Dublin. He very kindly took me on a tour. I'd never met Mark before, and Mark met me at the gates of the Pearse Lyons distillery, and he had a gift in his hand. He handed me over a bottle of the Teeling pot still, first batch of whiskey. We'd connected online, we'd had a chat. You know, the Irish whiskey community is a great community. And then we went and we did the tour. So Mark is from the area in Dublin, and Mark had done the tour many times, but he didn't mind at all going through it again. He just wanted to show me the Pearse Lyons distillery. So thanks, Mark, for that. I'll never forget that day. It was a great old time. And I'm delighted to be bringing Conor Ryan now from Pearse Lyons on shortly in a few minutes to talk to us about these great whiskies. Kelly is here. She had great fun last night in the tasting. Fantastic. This is great. So listen, we are in a lock-in. For those of you who are joining from Ireland, you know well what a lock-in is. For those of you who are joining from America, it might not be so obvious what a lock-in is, but all you need to know is that it's a uniquely Irish thing, and there's no point in being part of a lock-in if you're not part of it with Irish people. So Americans, you are amongst friends and you are amongst Irish whiskey community here. You're in the right company. We have a lock-in here. A lock-in is where, well, you might be surprised in America to know that in Ireland, the pubs close a little bit earlier than your own pubs close. It's not unusual for pubs to be closing before midnight, midweek in towns and cities around Ireland. And that's an awful early time for a pub to be closing, especially if you've got a good thirst on you. And so the lock-in is this unique thing created by the Irish to meet that need for thirst. So if you're sitting in a pub at 11:30 at night and you see the lights flashing, which is the universal symbol for last orders, and you go up and you try and order your 47 pints of Guinness, and then maybe the bartender says, no, you're just getting the one or the two, but you go back to your seat anyway, and you're waiting for that moment when the barman or the barwoman's going to walk past you, going to leave the bar, walk towards the front door, and they're going to open that door and let all the cold air in the hopes that you'll then go out so that they can clear out the bar. And you're afraid of this moment. You're not wanting this moment to arrive because you know it's coming. But there may be another way. You may find yourself in a position where it comes close to midnight and you're sitting in the bar and you're still thirsty. You can't get another drink because it's almost closing time, isn't it? But this time the bartender leaves the bar, walks towards the front door, and instead of opening it, he bolts it closed. And you're now locked in. You are inside the pub. You shouldn't be there, but you're locked in with the bartender and maybe a few of your friends. You see, over the course of the night, the barman, the barwoman have been eyeing up the group as well to see who is in the bar that they might want to spend time with. But you're locked in. It's against the law. You shouldn't really be there, but you are. And I think we're all in a great big lock-in at the moment, aren't we? We're locked in our homes. We're locked away from the things we're used to doing. We're locked away from our workplaces. But like any good Irish lock-in, we're going to make the most of it. And we're going to enjoy it. And we're going to do our best to enjoy it. And what better way than with good whiskies, just like in a real lock-in. And in real lock-ins, anything could happen. You mightn't pay for your drinks. You might start an old song. The barman might have a guitar or something behind the bar, play a bit of music. Anything could happen. But the good news is that you don't have to go home until everybody wants to go home. And we'll do the same tonight. So we won't leave until everybody wants to leave. So you're part of a lock-in. And I know a few of you have been part of lock-ins in Ireland. I know a few of you have come to lock-in, have come to bars with me in Ireland from America. Some of you who've come to my whiskey tastings have come to Ireland, and you've been lucky enough to, on your first or your second night in Ireland, to have found a lock-in. And some people wait years for the lock-in. And I remember when I brought a group over to Ireland, they got the lock-in on their second night, and they were convinced it happened every night of the week. But of course it doesn't. It's a rare thing. And if you get a good lock-in, you'll remember it the rest of your life. Matt Morrison said he had his first lock-in this year, and it was absolutely brilliant. There is nothing like a good lock-in, and I've been part of a good handful of them in my time that were life-changing occurrences. So I'm trying to recreate the best way I can a little bit of a lock-in here for us as well. So thanks everybody for joining. Billy Lighton is joining us. Hello, Billy. You're hopping from one live stream to another. Good man. John Fleming from Killarney's here with us. Great to see you, John. Jeff, James, and Moira, Paul, Quiveen. Brilliant. Great to see you all here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Conor Ryan we're going to have a guest with us tonight because I'm tired of doing all the talking. It's better for experts to be doing the talking instead of me. Conor Ryan's going to join us now. We'll bring Conor in. So Conor, welcome all the way from Kinsale in Cork. How are we doing?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me on, Barry. For the East Coast, good afternoon. For the West Coast, good evening. And for Ireland, you should be in bed. But to keep it authentic, we've actually set up station inside a locked bar in a secret location in Kinsale, just to keep it authentic.
Good man yourself. You sound like you're introducing the Eurovision Song Contest there. Hello from Ireland.
Excellent. Hello from Ireland.
So Conor is joining us from Kinsale in County Cork, and I brought Conor on because Conor is the Global Spirits Ambassador for Pearse Lyons and Pearse Irish Whiskey, and we've got two of those whiskies here tonight, and I'm delighted that Conor is going to give us a little bit of a walkthrough on what those are. But Conor, we had a nice old meeting there last year in Ireland, a little serendipitous meeting, such as Irish Whiskey Twitter. I tweeted out that I was in a bar up near the airport in Cork, and didn't you tweet back and said, "Sure, I'm only 10 minutes away. If you hang on there,
only around the corner." Yeah,
that's it. And we met up. We had an old coffee, which was great. The Irish whiskey community is a bit unique like that, isn't it? Finishing my coffee there now before I go into the whiskies. It's a small world, all right. Conor, I had a chance to visit Pearse Lyons Distillery about a year and a half ago. Mark Bergen from Whiskey or Whiskey took me in and took me on a great tour there. I'd love for you to give us an overview of the Pearse Lyons Distillery, a little bit of the story behind it before we crack into some of these great whiskies, because to me it's a fantastic story and maybe one of the most beautiful distilleries in Ireland, and I'll show some pictures as you're talking as well.
Perfect. I suppose before we actually start talking about the distillery itself, we need to talk about the man Pearse Lyons, our founder. So I suppose Pearse Lyons has got a very long history in Irish whiskey. Pearse would have been the first Irishman to get a master's in brewing distilling from the British Institute of Brewing Distilling. He would have then done his internship in Powers, John's Lane. After that, he would have worked with Guinness in the Harp Brewery. And then he went working on what we call the new Middleton distillery, the distillery that opened in 1975 in Middleton. After that, he went to the USA, brewing and distilling. And from there, he went more into yeast and set up a company called Alltech. Alltech is a yeast specialty company, predominantly to do with feed. And I suppose yeast is the building block for beer. Beer is the building block for whiskey. And he went right down to the root of what he was doing, because that was the mind of Pearse Lyons. And I suppose from there, set up a company in a garage that mushroomed out into a multinational company. And then he got the opportunity to go back into brewing and distilling in Lexington in Kentucky in 1999. While he was there, he then, from the brewing distilling side of things, he started distilling again in Kentucky. In 2008. So Pearse went kind of full circle, went from brewing distilling into his other business, which was yeast. And then he went back to distillation again in 2008 in Kentucky. He was lucky enough to be in a position to go back into his first love, his first passion. And I suppose it was his son, Mark Lyons, that actually helped that situation along. Mark himself, who is now our CEO, is the 7th generation in Irish whiskey in the Pearse Lyons, in the Lyons family. And so we're in good hands there. And he himself did a master's in Harriet Watt in brewing and distilling. So we're being well watched since, unfortunately, Pearse passed 2 years ago. And I suppose when we're talking to America, the story is interlaced so much between Ireland and the USA. It's incredible. From the barrels that we use in Ireland, come from our own sister distillery, Town Branch, and our brewery, Lexington Brewing. And I suppose when Pearse came back to Irish whiskey, I won't say when Pearse started distilling Irish whiskey in 2012, when Pearse came back to Irish whiskey in 2012, he was one of the early setters in the new wave of Irish distillers. And what we did was We brought Kentucky Vendome stills because Dr. Lyons liked to mix things up. When he started distilling in Lexington in Town Branch, he used Scottish stills and he used pot stills. And he was actually the first member of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail to pot still only their bourbon. Before that, people would have used pot and column or just column. So he's the first to pot still only his bourbon, bringing his Irish roots, his Irish learning, his Irish heritage of brewing and distilling with him to Lexington in Kentucky, where he was living at the time with his wife Deirdre. And I suppose when he also started off there, he started distilling single malt as, I suppose, a salute to what he learned in Ireland. And when Dr. Lyons started distilling single malt in Town Branch in Kentucky, it was the first time single malt was produced in America since in Kentucky since 1919. So in almost 100 years, Dr. Lyons always liked to do things a little bit different, a little bit outside of the norm, like to think around how can we do things differently. And by doing single malt back then, today we actually have a 12-year-old single malt in Lexington. Now we haven't released a 12-year-old age statement, but we have 12-year-old to come out this year. So I suppose that brings us back to when we started distilling in Carlow in 2012. When Dr. Lyons and Mrs. Lyons bought the site that we now call Pearse Lyons Distillery, it was a rundown church on St. James's Street in Dublin. 2 weeks after Dr. Lyons and Mrs. Lyons bought the church, it got turned into a national monument. So what was meant to be a 1.5-year project became a 4-year project. But he wasn't going to be deterred by that. So the stills were on the way. He'd done a handshake deal with Seamus O'Hara in O'Hara's Brewing. And we set up our stills in O'Hara's in Carlow. And when Pearse started distilling in Carlow, we were the 6th distillery to start distilling in Ireland in modern times. So we obviously had the big 3 before us, obviously your Bushmills, your Middleton and Cooley. Then you'd Kilbeggan, you'd West Cork, and we were the 6th people to start distilling. So that's why today we've got a 7-year-old whiskey at our disposal to start using as a single malt or as a malt in our blends. And then we distilled there for a couple of years, building up our stocks, and then we decommissioned the stills and moved them to their final resting place in what you see now is Pearse Lyons Distillery, which opened in July 2017. And I suppose the interesting thing about the stills being decommissioned is that in less than 8 years, they've already operated in 2 separate locations. So the whiskey that we made in Carlow, in the Carlow distillery, is now from a dead distillery, a lost distillery, a silent distillery, for whichever term you like to use yourself. And we've been distilling now since 2017 on our site on St. James's Street. So I see Barry put up a picture of the church.
Yeah, beautiful.
So
beautiful
this church, now that we get to the church side of things, this is just the St. James's Church. Our distillery, Pearse Lyons Distillery, is just breathtaking. When you walk in, it's a tactile experience. I mean, you can literally see everything from the water purification to the brew house to the stills. Everything happens as you see it. Beautiful and all as a distillery is, it's a fully functioning distillery. The only thing that we don't do on site is we don't mill the grain that comes in ground to specification, and we don't cask on site. The spirit leaves the distillery at casking strength, and then we cask in 2 separate locations outside of that. So as I said, the renovation took 4 years. The church was renovated back to first day standards when it was built in the mid 1800s, and it's just a spectacular thing to see. And I suppose one of the things that we did as a distillery under the supervision of Mrs. Lyons, who just did a spectacular job on the renovation, was you put a glass spire on top of the church to show that there was we call it the Liberty's Lantern, is to show that there's a new light, a new era of distilling in the area, because now it's spectacular. That area used to be the golden triangle of Irish whiskey historically, and now we've got 4 functioning distilleries in the area, which is just spectacular. And there's even 2 on St. James's Street. So it's an amazing place to visit. Pictures don't do it justice. And when you get the opportunity, you'll see it for yourself.
So, Conor, when they started excavating or started refurbishing that old site, I know there were some other whiskey connections were found on site, because I know it abuts a graveyard, an old cemetery there on site as well. And tell us what famous whiskey legend is buried in the graveyard there beside the church.
Well, we've literal whiskey, Irish whiskey royalty. We've James Power and his wife Mary buried in the church there. James Power, the founder of Power's Whiskey, John's Lane Distillery, which is today is one of the most spectacular Irish pot stills on the market. If Billy's watching, I know that Redbreast is, but I'd be a big Powers fan myself. And I suppose I've heard Barry say it in the past before. In Ireland, there was different. Each house had a brand, and our house would have been a Powers house. Woo. And there was always a bottle of Powers in the cabinet at home. And especially my grandfather, you could not go into my grandfather's house without taking, I suppose, as Americans would term it, 3 fingers of whiskey up the glass. There was no small measures for my granddad.
I love the connection. There's so many tangents of the story of Pearse Lyons, from the American-Irish connection between Kentucky and Ireland, between the stills, etc., and what Dr. Pearse Lyons did himself in America, but then also going back into the kind of the annals of Irish history as well. There's lots of, if I recall on the tour, they shared how some of Pearse Lyons' own his own ancestors would have been part, or kind of going back the family tree, they would have been part of distilling or coopering history in Dublin as well, if I recall correctly.
Absolutely. There's many spokes to the wheel, I suppose, of Pearse whiskey. Pearse himself was the 6th generation of his family to be involved in the Irish whiskey industry, but the 5 generations before him were coopers. And his uncle's cooperage in Smithfield was actually one of the last cooperages in Dublin, and he actually signed the documentation where the Coopers Guild was kind of dismantled when there wasn't a need for wet barrels so much anymore. But a very interesting story is about Pearse's grandaunt, Molly Dunn. She was actually the first female cooper ever registered in Ireland. So there's a long history with Dr. Lyons and that area. And I suppose the reason that Dr. Lyons decided on that church as a site for his distillery was he saw it was falling down, it was in bad condition, it was for sale. That church on the other side of his family, so the Dunns were the Coopers, but on the Lyons side of his family, that was actually their family church. The first funeral Pearse ever attended was his grandfather's funeral in that church. And we subsequently realized that he's got 9 relatives buried in the graveyard at rest outside of his own distillery.
Only in Ireland could you have stories like this.
Nowhere
else on earth. It's incredible.
It is incredible.
You've released some whiskies have been released then that are technically older than the distillery there, because you were distilling elsewhere. You were so unbeknownst to many in Carlow, you were busy distilling away prior to moving the stills into the new distillery, and you've kind of selected 2 whiskies you want us to talk about and try today and introduce to an American audience as well as our Irish audience. And you've got the first one you've shared with me here is this Pearse Lyons or Pearse Irish Whiskey Distiller's Choice. I'd love if you, Conor, could talk us through the thought behind how this came about, and then talk us through a little sip of it as I open the bottle here and pour a drop into my glass.
And I'll do likewise.
Good man. So you're not supposed to declare your location in Cork, no, for fear people will storm the bar knowing there's somebody inside it.
There will be a storming, so we'll keep it quiet. Everyone should be at home, safe and wrapped up with their loved ones now at this time.
Well, I appreciate you coming out at midnight in Ireland to find your way into a pub to open up a bottle of whiskey. Tough life.
So I suppose going back to the start, when we started to release our own whiskey in 2017, we had a range of whiskey. Dr. Lyons didn't want us to have one whiskey or 2. He knows that everybody's got a different palate. So spread a wide net, create some very different whiskies. So we brought out a range, the original, which was our starting point, had a green label. Our distillers had a red label. Our 12-year-old had a black label. Now those 3 have got a facelift. They were in a much a shorter squat bottle And what we've done differently in the last 12 months was we've raised the age in the, also gone age statement across the board. Now, I suppose two things that I'd like to point out about the Pearse whiskies always is that obviously because Dr. Lyons has got a yeast specialty company, all the yeast that we use to create our whiskies are proprietary yeast to Alltech. So we use different strains of yeast for different whiskies. And also the barrels at the end, everything that isn't a wine barrel comes from our sister distillery, Town Branch in Kentucky, or Lexington Brewing and Distilling. And then the third thing, I suppose, is that all of our whiskies are natural color. So this is a 7 to 9 year old whiskey. And I suppose if people know or don't know, some people use coloring, some people don't. But the philosophy of Alltech, I suppose, I brought one of the Alltech pins with me, and I don't know if you can see it here. Underneath the company name Alltech, there's one word, and it's always been Pearse's philosophy: naturally. So everything we do is natural. So even our gins, they're all done London dry style, only natural flavors. In our whiskies, we only do natural color. So what you see is what you get. You're drinking whatever the barrel has given you in your whiskey. So with our Pearse 7-year-old distillers, what you're getting is a malt forward blend. So as a rough benchmark in blended whiskey, you'd have maybe 20% malt, 80% grain. Or we're in Ireland, so a lot of our blends are pot still based. But in general terms, if it's a malt grain blend, it'd be 20-80. What we've done with this one is it's 38% malt and the remainder is grain. Now, we don't make grain, the grain is sourced, but at least with the malt component, we're actually able to use our own malt in this. And the whiskey before this one in our range is our Pearse 5. It's our Pearse 5 original. That's a blended whiskey as well. And that one is a 5 to 7 year old whiskey. So this one here, 7 to 9 year old whiskey, we're using 3 barrel types in this. And I suppose this is where we get to really tie in historically what Ireland would use for barrels, but also from our own personal history by using our barrels from Kentucky. So what we've done is this whiskey is released natural color at 43% non-chill filtered. The barrel usage in this is it's B1, which is ex-bourbon barrel, and the B1s that we use come from Town Branch. We also use ex-Kentucky bourbon barrel ale. So we, in Lexington Brewing, we've got a beer that we make in America that's been out for almost 20 years. It's got a fantastic cult following in the USA. And I loved when I did, when I could travel and I was going to the US, I want to tell people that some of the barrels that we use in this whiskey come from Kentucky bourbon barrel ale. There's an extra interest in it because it was an American beer that they knew and they could associate that we've used in this whiskey. And then the third barrel we use, of course, because it's a very traditional style barrel to Ireland, we use sherry as well in this. So it's bourbon, Kentucky bourbon barrel ale, and sherry. So it's 3 barrels. This whiskey here, this is almost like your Swiss Army knife in the range because this is handy for all occasions. You can use this, honestly.
Breakfast, lunch, dinner.
Oh, literally, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But also sipping, long drinks, short drinks, and it's a brilliant complement to food. This whiskey here, I absolutely love it, like with white fish, like a cod or a hake with a pea risotto. You can have it with steak. Goes really well with cheese, and it goes really well with goes really well with a milk chocolate more than dark chocolate. Yeah. So you can eat with it, you can sip with it. It's just a fantastically universal whiskey.
You sold us.
So I'm just going to give it a little sip. I'll talk what I get. I don't like to tell people too much about what I taste because what I taste is going to be completely different from what other people taste. Everybody's tasting journey is different. It's like, it all depends on your mood, the time of the day, what you've had to eat. If you're not eating, it's very personal what people taste. So I just like to tell people what it is, but I will give it a sip. And whatever glassware you like to use is your own business. If you like to ice, it's your own business. Drinking whiskey is a personal experience that should be just the person who's holding the glass, they're the boss of their own tasting experience. But I'm going to give this a little sip. So with this whiskey, I always get a good balance between spirit and wood. And I suppose that was very important for Dr. Lyons when he brought out a range first. He wanted the spirit to show, but it also be enhanced by the wood. So I know when I drink this, and people have done this to me, where I can actually pull out our own spirit, even if it's in a blend, in blind tastings, and it's good fun because it shows that there's a good harmony between the spirit and the wood. So with this, obviously, I get a lovely balance. The vanilla is very forward, of course, because there's a big bourbon influence. Like a little caramelized, a little bit of your creme brulee. There's a nice oak wood spice with it, and there is a reminiscent dried fruit note as well that comes with it as well. But it's a lovely oily whiskey on the palate. I suppose an interesting tidbit about when Dr. Lyons started distilling first, because we started distilling in the summertime in 2012, he was very conscious about the barrels coming over. You wouldn't normally try and transport your barrels during the summertime because they'd heat up, they can go off very easily. So the barrels that we got brought over for a long time were actually brought over in refrigerated containers, so that when they got to us, they were as fresh and cool and juicy as possible. As soon as they were decanted over in town branch, they were sent over to us in Ireland. So
they were ready for the Irish summer. They came refrigerated.
Refrigerated containers that came in. A great synergy to have between the two distilleries.
I've always, anytime I taste a whiskey from Pearse Lyons, there's a different flavor profile that I've always, my amateur palate struggles to pick up. But I'm wondering, is it to do with the yeast? Is the yeast strain giving a particular flavor profile? Do you think a contribution to the whiskeys that might not be the same elsewhere?
Of course, the yeast is the building block. Depending on, also we don't brew our beer very high either. We try and keep the flavor in the beer, or in the wash. Sorry, the beer. Like when you make whiskey, you make an unhopped beer essentially first, a wheat beer. So that we only bring our beer to about 7.5%. We don't push it any higher. We're not looking for huge yields. We're looking for flavor. And of course, having your own proprietary strains of yeast mean that you got your own proprietary building blocks for making your whiskey. Like our single malt new make is genuinely, I mean, I've been lucky enough over the years to taste a lot of distilleries' new makes, and genuinely, hand on heart, our new make is as good as anyone's I've ever tasted before. And that's not just a company line, that's a whiskey enthusiast telling a story of how it is.
So Conor, it's double distilled, right? So double distilled, yeah. Liquid that's in here, some of it came from Carlo when you were distilling there, and some of it from
I know all the malt in this is Carlo.
All the malt is Carlo.
So when we were distilling in Carlo, we were under the watchful eye then of Jack O'Shea, the infamous Jack O'Shea, another masters in brewing distilling from Harriet Watt, a legend, an infamous character in Irish whiskey. And Jack was fastidious about everything that we did and was great. Jack was there for the decommissioning and recommissioning of the stills again. And I suppose what is probably helping to impart a unique flavor on our whiskey, not just the yeast, but also the stills. So we use Kentucky Vendome stills. And when they came to Ireland first, they caused a bit of consternation because their setup was not normal for Irish whiskey. Our second still, Little Lizzie we call it, is a pot still at the bottom, and it's got not your traditional swan neck on top. It's got 4 rectifying plates, and I suppose those rectifying plates allow for a greater reflux if you want. You can create a heavier or a lighter spirit depending on how you want to distill your spirit. Even the end spirit we never bring above, from a double distillation, about 72-74% ABV. So we're not looking to distill out to get high alcohol. We're looking to distill to keep flavor from our raw ingredients. And I suppose the proof of the pudding's in the tasting. When you get to taste the new make, it's beautiful. And I suppose the yeast, along with the distillation, it keeps a lot of fruity esters,
Yeah.
and we there's a lot of that we've brought out have been not very, like, we have whiskies that we are going to bring out that are going to be more cask influenced. Like we did bring out a limited edition called our Cooper Select, and that was a salute to Pearse Lyons' family, the Duns. So the Coopers, which is here again, this was a natural color whiskey. This is the bottle that it went in and stayed in. The color of this was just incredible, and this was all about the wood. This was about trying to immerse people into a barrel. You were looking at really huge wood notes, caramelized orange, burnt treacle, toasted wood, charred wood, huge wood notes. It basically transports you into a barrel. It was an exceptional whiskey that we brought out. But a lot of the other whiskies are spirit wood balanced. That was more wood because that's what it was for. That was our Cooper Select. And I suppose we're going to dip in and out of the wood forward and spirit forward whiskies. And this one here, the 7-year-old, is I personally think is a happy medium. And just 6 weeks ago or so, in the World Whiskies Awards, it got awarded the best blended whiskey in Ireland under 12 years old. So it done well against its peers.
There's a complexity to it that belies its years, and there's the more I come back to it, having let it here in the glass for a little bit, there's layers that I'm getting. There's those, I'm getting those dried fruits. I'm getting a little bit of the grass. I'm getting the biscuitiness of a almost like some of the biscuity qualities that you would associate typically with a single malt are kind of coming through as well for me. Tell me a little bit about the goal of Pearse Irish Whiskey in terms of what style of whiskey the brand wants to be known for. You mentioned Redbreast and Middleton, and we associate single pot still with Middleton, as they were the only ones who were producing it for many years. What's the hope at Pearse Lyons of what you want to be known for going forward?
What Pearse always wants to be known for is something that was a credible whiskey, that when people buy a Pearse Lyons whiskey, that they know they're buying a certain quality point, certain standard. There's going to be many different versions of Pearse Lyons whiskey, but you're going to know that you're going to get the best made spirit possible in the best whiskey barrels possible. Now, the whiskey industry, you know, we're only standing on the shoulders of giants before us. The whiskey industry, you know, is almost you can't fake time. So we don't have stock that we can blend back in. I mean, I know that when there's other beautiful pastels on the market that might be 12 years old, but they could have a 15-year-old inclusion. I know some, when they come out first, might have had a 20-year-old inclusion, and you can add that complexity into your whiskey. We don't have that yet, but what we have is a well-made spirit in quality selected barrels, and I suppose it'll be about provenance. And by provenance, I mean just a passion for making something the correct way. And I suppose, as I said earlier on, when Pearse Lyons started distilling again in Ireland in 2012, he was coming back to distilling in Ireland. When the distillery opened up in 2017, it would have been the third distillery that Pearse would have overseen opening up in Ireland. So there's not many people who would have opened up 3 distilleries in their lifetime. And I suppose, unfortunately, Dr. Lyons passed away, as we said, just 2 years ago. But posthumously, for his efforts in distilling, he was indoctrinated into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame for his work over in the USA as well.
I know he was almost more well known in Kentucky over the last few years of his life, wasn't he? More than Ireland, where he's
absolutely
spent most of the time in Kentucky. And I've had people in Ohio mention their affection for what he and his family did in Lexington and in Kentucky, and their contribution to the community there, which he did almost without recognition in Ireland. You know, he was out there doing a lot for the community he lived in. But it's great to see the church, the building, the distillery is quite the shrine to his efforts, isn't it? Over the years,
absolutely,
too.
And the efforts of Mrs. Lyons. I
Right.
mean, the level of detail. I mean, she oversaw the project management of the restoration. The lengths that they'd go through to get it back to its former glory was incredible. They had to reopen a slate quarry in Wales to get the exact same slate for the roof. They had to reopen a limestone quarry in France to get the exact same limestone just to make everything perfect.
Amazing.
And you've been in yourself. I mean, you've probably seen the pictures inside where all the windows were bricked up. They had to literally be chiseled out by hand to get the bricked up windows taken out. We got some beautiful custom stained glass windows to put in to show that it's as a respectful salute to its ecclesiastical heritage, but also to paint a picture of the brewing and distilling that's going on inside there now.
It's fantastic. I like from the moment I first set foot inside the building, I've maintained it is Ireland's most beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, gorgeous distillery, and something that a place that everyone should visit. And I love history. I love history of Ireland, the history of Irish whiskey. It's all there in one building, isn't it? The legends of Irish whiskey buried in the graveyard.
Without a doubt. I mean, Dr. Lyons always made sure that we knew that whiskey is only part of our story. And that was one of the lines he used to always tell us. Whiskey is only part of our story. There's been a church on that site for almost 800 years. We mentioned, like from distilling royalty, James Power. We also had Sylvester Costigan, which people kind of maybe over bypass. He sold his distilleries to George Rowe. So he's also buried there. The precursor to George Rowe Distilleries, Sylvester Costigan, is buried there. The co-signer of the Guinness lease is buried there. So there's a lot of brewing and distilling heritage there. And coincidentally, on the other side of his family, when I look out the back of the church down to the Guinness barrel yard down on the left, if I'm looking down, he'd an uncle that used to captain a barge that used to bring the Guinness barrels from the Guinness yard down into the city and beyond, down into the port. So I'd like to think that sometimes he handled that member of the family handled barrels from the Dunn side of the family, and it was a really serendipitous meeting in the back of St. James's Church, so to speak.
You couldn't make up those stories. If you did, people wouldn't believe you.
You can't. Like what when I tell stories, and I suppose when having stories and such, when I was going to US with the US team, and I might be talking to bartenders, I might be talking to groups of people telling the story about Pearse Lyons Distillery. One of the guys commented saying, you actually and in a few nights in a row, he goes, you almost haven't told the exact same story every time. It's different every time. And it's not that I'm making something else up. There's so much information to get in. I normally go off. I normally go off people's faces in a room. And you know, if I say yeast sometime and someone looks very interested, we might focus on the yeast. If I talk about the barrels, they focus on the barrels. You know, you just gauge the room. Obviously, I'm gauging the back of my phone right now, so we're just telling an overview story of Dr. Lyons and his history.
It take me weeks to get into all of it. I remember Carol,
literally
down in Middleton, the archivist Carol Quinn in Middleton, saying to me when I first visited her, and she was showing me the old Powers archives, and she said, "We don't have to make up any stories at all in Irish whiskey because the truth is far more interesting." And it is. There's just so much there if we can excavate it and kind of share it. Tell me a little bit, Conor, about. I know this is available in Ireland, but there's a lot of our viewers are in the United States. Is this particular expression available in the US?
Absolutely is. What I might do afterwards is I'll put a link on your site.
Yep.
Or I'll share it with you. And it's a branch distillery over in the USA. And we import our own spirit. And then obviously we have our different distributors in each state. We're not all over, but there is a good representation around the country. And you'll always know a friend traveling who'll sneak you a bottle of the good stuff back to your house whenever.
So see, not only is Conor sequestered away in a pub in Ireland, he's now recommending bootlegging in America, where you can cross state lines with whiskey. You heard it here first, folks.
Well, if you're giving someone a gift for a dinner party, you know, it'd be rude not to bring something that they can't.
Be very rude. Well, I'm delighted to hear.
Not bring something interesting.
That's it. I know there was some commentary earlier on the Facebook page. People were hoping that Pearse whiskies were available in the US, and there are Pearse whiskies, both Irish and American. There's Pearse bourbons as well, isn't there? That's available. Yep. So we'll post the link to that on the Facebook group, Irish Whiskey Fans of America. I want you, Conor, to tell me about this other whiskey that found its way in my door. God knows how, but it landed on my doorstep the other day, and that is. yet another whiskey from Pearse Lyons called Halfpenny Irish Whiskey. And I know nothing about it. I've not opened it. I've not heard anything about it. I'm at your mercy to give us all the information about this one. It seems
Good
very,
stuff.
very
Okay.
Irish brand.
So we, I suppose, one of the first spirits that we released from Alltech, from Pearse Lyons Group in Ireland, was our Halfpenny Gin. So it was a London Dry 13 botanical gin. A salute to, I suppose, the botanical gardens that would have been in the Phoenix Park in 1816, dandelion, geranium, lavender, blackberry, that kind of thing. So that gin was out in the market. Then we brought out a rhubarb version of that gin. And this whiskey came about because of requests from the trade. People were carrying the Halfpenny gin, and they were looking for, I don't want to be sexist, but a brother to the sister or a partner, a whiskey partner for the gin. And instead of them having to kind of marry together the story of the Halfpenny gin and a Pearse whiskey, we got asked for a Halfpenny whiskey. So we brought out a Halfpenny whiskey. So this whiskey here is another brand from the Pearse Lyons distillery. Obviously, we said we have our gin, but also we've got two versions of this whiskey, but this one here, the 4 cask, is available in the USA. This whiskey here again, on-chill filtered, 43% ABV, the same as our Pearse whiskies. This one here, we reference it and we call it the 4 cask. This one here, it's got it's bourbon barrel malt. We've got sherry barrels. We've got a double charred barrel grain, and we've got a little bit of port pipe malt as well in this. So each whiskey, I suppose, for people who want to know, each whiskey is aged separately as components and brought together. So it's not finished in 4 different casks through its life cycle. We have 4 different component whiskeys aging, 2 sets of grain, 2 sets of malts, and we marry them, we vat them together for the bottling of this whiskey here. This whiskey here is 34% malt, and the remainder is grain. And I'm going to pour a little bit of this one.
Connor, I notice on the label it doesn't mention anything like it's not a single malt, it's not a pot still, obviously. It's not. Is it a blended whiskey, or does it fall outside of those characteristics completely?
No, it's absolutely a blended whiskey.
It is blended.
So it's 34% malt. The remainder is grain. It's an NAS, so a no age statement whiskey. Our Pearse whiskies all carry an age statement now, but we went NAS on this, and this is it's not declared, but if you ask, and I'm telling you, it's a 4 to 10 year old whiskey.
4 to 10.
Grain, a small, 4 to 10. There's some 4-year-old grain, then there's 5 and 6-year-old malt, and the malt is ours, and that's 34% of the inclusion. And then there's much older grain as well, jumping between 7 and 9 years as well. So this one here, we'll give it a little smell and a little taste. Much richer in color, but I suppose the younger grain with the older malt and the older grain gives it. This is a very. The nose doesn't tell you what's going to go on in the mass in this one. I suppose when you taste it, I suppose when you're tasting whiskey, a lot of the time, people sip it and then put water in it straight away. What I like to do personally when I open up a bottle first, I like you'll find it yourself. When you might like it, you might not like it, you might put it back on the shelf. You might try it again, you might be indifferent, you put it back on the shelf. Then the third time you might pull it down, and all of a sudden you find the whiskey is a complete. You actually love it, or it's changed. So oxygen changes a whiskey in a huge way. So I always, when I'm tasting whiskey for the first time, I always like to taste it, let the glass aside, come back to it, and do this like literally over the space of an hour or more when I'm tasting a whiskey for the first time, before I add water to it, just to give the whiskey the opportunity to oxidize a little bit, because some whiskeys do better with a little bit of air and oxygen to it. Like we brought out a whiskey just lately, a distillery edition. It was one of the first known blended malts in Ireland. It was a marriage of our own malt and source malt, and that whiskey in particular is a whiskey that's a prime example of a whiskey that loves oxygen, not water. If you water it down, It loses its impact. But give it a little bit of time in the glass, because this will be much more herbal at the start, and it gets richer afterwards.
I definitely get the richness after a few sips. I get that the influence of the port pipe. There's a dry, dark red fruit coming to me a little bit there now in the 3 or 4 sips in.
Actually, for an Irish whiskey, it makes a very decent old fashioned. If you're at home over the long weekend and you have a bottle, it makes the dryness that you mentioned there, Barry, the dryness and the fruit notes lend itself very well to an old fashioned style whiskey. But yeah, this one again, another whiskey that does well as a short drink, goes great in long drinks as well.
Maureen has a question that Conor, you as a spirits expert will be able to answer far better than I would. How much does the oxidation differ between cork and screw cap? This came up at a tasting or Jameson tasting last night too. Is there any difference in terms of how long you can keep a bottle once it's opened, depending on cork or screw cap? Does it affect it?
Ooh, okay. We'll go back to storing whiskey in the first place. So when you see a wooden cork on a whiskey, I suppose you've got 3 dangers to a whiskey, and there's one extra one when it comes to wooden corks. If people are used to storing wines in a nice underside and whatever, alcohol is quite abrasive. So whiskey should always be kept standing up. Wooden corks are not good to be left sideways, because it will burn into the wood, and your whiskey will never go off, by the way. It just won't taste the way it should do. And by the way I say it should do, it won't taste the way the distillery wanted it to go. So wooden cork and screw cork, but you can get them more now because they have a kind of a rubber inside on the inside of them. Whiskey will last longer nowadays with a screw cap. Before, with a wooden cork, it was always good to just give it a splash of liquid every so often, every few months, just to keep it moist and keep it stretched out. The only fear when you're storing whiskey long term is that the wooden cork shrinks and oxygen gets into it. Now, as I said, your biggest fear with your whiskey is that it gets too much oxygen and it'll lose all of its fruity notes and it'll just get bit insipid, or sunlight. So the things you have to watch out for when you're storing a whiskey, and if you've got a good whiskey, oxygen and sunlight. If you've got a particularly good whiskey that you want to pull out every now and then, and just share with a friend or spoil yourself every now and then, once it kind of goes a third of the way down the bottle, it's probably a good idea, if it's a really good one, to decant it into a smaller bottle. I know it won't look the same when you're taking it out, but decant it into a smaller bottle, because oxygen is not your friend long term. But a little bit of oxygen can open out a whiskey in a way that people use water to do it quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah. I love leaving oxygen in a glass. I mean, actually, if Billy is still there, there was a whiskey that I literally came back to 14 hours later. I was tasting Manuel Love Redbreast when it came out first, and I was tasting it at night, and I put the glass down, I left it by the sink, and I came back, and the next morning the smell of delicious wood and sherry from that glass was exceptional.
Yeah, I do. I often do the same. Yeah,
exceptional.
You leave that glass with a little bit inside it at night, you come back the next morning, you could put your nose inside that glass for hours, couldn't you?
Oh, hours.
Yeah.
And sometimes, one of the things that I do when I'm not working with Pearse and when I'm not working in a bar, I'd work with the Cork Whisky Society, probably one of the best whiskey tasting societies in the world, I would say.
Great.
And because I would work in a bar, I would sometimes have the joy of taking away all of our glasses afterwards. And sometimes I wouldn't have the time to take the glasses out of the car at night. And then I'd go into the car in the morning, and the sweet smell of wood. Wood just becomes more prominent with oxygen.
Yeah.
So oxygen is not your friend long term, but it's your friend short term. And when you're storing whiskey, screw cap versus cork, just have them standing up. You're probably not going to have, unless it's a vintage bottle, maybe by vintage I mean pre-80s, then you won't have to worry about the cork doing anything. But if your whiskey goes down, once it goes down a third to a half into the bottle, and it's a whiskey that you find particularly special, put it into a smaller bottle. It won't look the same, but you'll appreciate the taste. Or if you're a wine person and you have at your disposal something like the Corrovine wine sets, basically what that'll do is it'll put a needle down through your wooden cork. Well, you take out your cork, put in a normal wooden cork. It puts a needle down into your whiskey bottle. It's got an inert gas in it. You press the button on it, you pour it out, and it'll express out the whiskey measure you want, but put in an inert gas instead. So you can keep it in your same bottle, and you'll have that first day freshness all the time. Now that's if you've bought an exceptionally old and expensive bottle of whiskey, because I think that set is about maybe.
From Jeff, actually, Jeff Toomey asks about that, about the inert gas. You've answered that, and I notice you've got this synthetic cork for the halfpenny, and I've pulled out a cork out of Redbreast there. That's the wooden cork from the Redbreast.
Yep.
And you've got the synthetic cork, which probably lasts a bit longer, I'd imagine, as well in that bottle.
As I said, those whiskies you're probably going to drink within 6 months, so it's not a problem.
Yeah.
But when it goes over the 6 month mark, it'll never go off. Your whiskey won't go off. I remember me and my good wife down in Castlemartyr one time, and we got a whiskey, and I couldn't get over the color of it, and it was a grain whiskey that had actually been, like, their windows were sealed afterwards for UV, but it had gone paler. It tasted perfect because it was stored in the window. It tasted perfect, but it just gone paler to the look. And eventually it will degrade the whiskey inside. But
right.
But yeah, 6 months in an open bottle will do your whiskey no harm.
You mentioned earlier, or somebody mentioned in the comments, your marriage of malt. So you've released a new whiskey, which is a relatively new, or in fact, a remarkably new offering for the Irish whiskey market. Tell us a little bit about this new product, because I know it's catching a lot of people's attention.
Absolutely. We brought out just a small release for a distillery exclusive only of 888 bottles. I suppose the reason for the 888 bottles, I mentioned earlier on that we've had a church on the site of the distillery for 800 years. We're in Dublin 8, and the third 8 for the 888 was the fact that it's the infinity symbol, the sign of marriage, on its side. So that's why we called it the marriage of malt. With that, what we did was it was a 6-year malt of our own making, and it was 66% of our own malt. And then it was married with a 13 and a 15-year-old malt from another distillery. It was aged in bourbon and PX casks. And I suppose it's the spirit of innovation that Pearse Lyons would have distilled into us, pardon the pun. Instead, these days, and actually I was watching the podcast earlier on with Billy on WhiskeyCast, and there was a question asked about wooden barrels and how far is it going to go? Because obviously in Ireland, classically in Ireland, we would have been very much a wine-orientated country. Because distilleries didn't bottle their own whiskey, wine merchants became spirit merchants, and wine merchants, ergo the name, used to bring in wine. Sherry's, ports, Madeiras. At one stage, Ireland was the second highest consumer per capita of sherry in the world. Like, we love our fortified wines. So we would have been a very big wine country. And I suppose at the moment, what we're finding is some for the good, some for the interesting, and some for everybody's in a rush to find, because in Ireland, unlike Scotland, let's say, we're allowed to use a wooden barrel rather than being just a straight up oak barrel like people would have been used to in Scottish whiskey. And us allowing us to have the use of wooden barrels is phenomenal, because it allows for a huge diversity of flavor. And that diversity of flavor is super important when a lot of distilleries, and we're one, we use some whiskey that isn't ours. We're very lucky that we started early enough that we actually have a lot of our own whiskey, but it allows people to put their own personal stamp, their own personal flavor on it. I suppose because we've got our own spirit, our own whiskey DNA that's unique to us, we can add our own flavor to things. And with the marriage of malt, what we wanted to do was to maybe just show that there are other ways. And when it was brought out, I asked all the guys that I know that know stuff, and we didn't know of another blended malt since, or prior to that. but what we call it, well, it's a marriage malt, it's a vatted malt, it's a blended malt, what it's called now, but older people in the industry would know it as a vatted malt. And instead of it being a traditional blend, and a traditional blend in Ireland would be a mixture of malt and grain or pot still and grain, it's actually a mixture of two malts. And why is that significant? I suppose it shows kind of a coming of age in Ireland, where now there are multiple stockable. And it didn't have to be just a minimum aged whiskey. You know, we used our 6-year-old and we used a 13 and 15-year-old inclusion from another distillery. And I suppose it was just showing that you can be different, you can innovate without replicating what everybody else is doing by actually marrying together different flavors of spirit.
I think that's a great point you've made, that I want to make sure it's not lost. Irish whiskey is now at a point where there is enough aged stock available for distilleries to be able to blend or vat together malts from different distilleries. Historically, that wouldn't have been, or in the last 100 years, that would have been a huge challenge. Of course, Scotland, most of the Scotch whiskey industry is built on blended malts, isn't it? Vatted malts together, the marriage malt.
Very commonplace in Scotland and in Japan, because Japan tries to emulate Scotland. But it wasn't a done thing. Blending the same spirit from multiple distilleries hadn't been done prior to that, because there wasn't the availability of aged stock of the same spirit from multiple distilleries.
Right. Yep. That's a huge milestone for Irish whiskey. Stephen McGuinness has a question for you here, Conor. Well, it's a serious question. He's not heckling you.
Oh, good.
Not yet. The night is young. He says that Carlow was the first mothball distillery or silent distillery in Ireland of recent times. Will there ever be a whiskey released stating Carlow on the whiskey alone? As without a doubt, in time, this liquid could be the rarest cask in Ireland. There's an interesting one.
It's a good. It is a good point, Steve. The 5-year-old that one of the viewers mentioned earlier on, the 5-year-old single malt, when we brought that out a year and a half ago, that would have been the first new Irish whiskey age statement that is 5-year-old in almost 25 years since Cooley started producing. We plan, and we have a lot of releases planned this year, and one of them will be a salute, without going into too much of that, just a salute and a nod to the fact that it's from a lost distillery or a silent distillery or a dead distillery, whichever terminology you like to use for it. So but it was closed for a good reason, just for the equipment to be disassembled and reassembled in another place. But technically, yes, it's from a lost distillery.
And normally when we're hearing about lost or silent distilleries, it's because there was no demand for the whiskey and they had to shut down. But in this case, you were simply transporting the stills elsewhere.
But because the even though the brew house, even though the wash that went into the stills was still 7.5%, I checked this with Jack O'Shea. In theory, the whiskey should be almost identical, but you'll never get it absolutely identical because it's a different brew house.
And the winds would blow differently in Dublin than they would down in Carlow and affect that distillation. You got that Dublin weather. Michael Cully has a question. Does Pearse Lyons Distillery do a cask strength bottle pour like you could get perhaps in the gift shops in Jameson or Teeling?
We did we did a one-off with the 5-year-old, just mentioning that again. We did a 1,000 bottle edition in Dublin Airport, and that was the only cask strength that we brought. But everything is on the cards. I suppose whiskey is a long game, and we're in it for the long haul. So there's a lot of whiskeys that we need to bring out, and that we want to bring out even this year. I went through the schedule only recently about releases, and this particular year, the Marriage of Malt was only the first of a very, very, very exciting list of releases that we're going to do this year.
So can you tell us about any of those? Or are they all secret? You hinted at some Carlow there. What can we expect?
There will be a whiskey focusing on Carlow by two. Actually, there's two different versions going to be a big focus on Carlow of limited editions. There'll be another. Actually, what's going to be very interesting is what's going to come out after September. There's a release coming out after September that I recommend you watch like hawks.
Go on. You can't leave it. You can't leave us hanging like that. We need at least another little tidbit.
No,
No.
it's a cliffhanger.
Cliffhanger.
That's for when I come back for the next talk on stories and sips and stuff.
Oh, is that right? We won't have you back if you don't tell us. That's 5 months away. That's a long cliffhanger.
No, but we honestly, there is 2 releases in the near future that are very, very, very close to what Stephen's talking about, and then there's one release in September that's very historic.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. We won't push you too much on that. And you mentioned the Halfpenny Gin earlier. Happen to have a bottle of the Halfpenny Gin here, the rhubarb gin, which was the precursor to the whiskey brand, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And that's how the Halfpenny came about. It was demand from the on-trade, just to have a partnering branded bottle, basically.
For those who are not familiar with the Halfpenny Bridge, which is immortalized here on the label, tell us what the Halfpenny Bridge is and where it is.
So the Halfpenny Bridge was built in 1816. It was before then you had to get the road as you see it now going down Dublin over the Liffey was much wider, and you'd have to get a little ferry over and back. So the Halfpenny Bridge was the first footbridge, or the first bridge, instead of footbridge, over spanning north and south, spanning the Liffey. And the reason it got called it was called the Liffey Bridge, but the reason it got called the Halfpenny Bridge was because it used to cost half a penny to cross the bridge. So that's a half penny, a halfpenny, and that's why it's called a Halfpenny Bridge. And that's why I suppose that's why we use the brand. It's a distinctively Dublin brand, and the tagline, I suppose, for the Halfpenny brand is bringing people together or connecting people, and it was connecting the both sides of the Liffey. So we like to think that when you're having a whiskey or you're having your G&T, that you have it in good company, and it's about connecting with people.
Love it. I've always maintained whiskey's about bringing people together, and so are bridges.
Absolutely.
So are bridges. Great stuff. Let me see if there's more questions here for you, Conor. Paul Sauer asks if you'll have a port release at any time. So there is a port component here, port pipe to the Halfpenny blend. What about a port release?
Honestly, no, not this year. Port isn't talked about. What's talked about this year is, again, the Carlo side of things. There's some interesting barrels that are going to give an unusual flavor that we beats us to it. But yeah, there's some, and let me see. Yeah, 3 out of 5 scheduled releases this year are going to be of only our own malt from Carlo.
Excellent. Nice. Looking forward to seeing.
So as I said, the marriage malt was only kicking off this year for us of I suppose keeping our core, our 5, 7, and 12-year-old whiskies. Obviously the 5 and 7 have our own liquid in it. But even the 12-year-old whiskey that we have would use, in 2014, all the source whiskey that we had, we recasked again into Town Branch barrels. And I suppose Town Branch bourbon using a nice amount of rye in their inclusion in their mash bill. It even gives our own 12-year-old that's sourced a unique flavor of its own. Okay,
very good. A lot of requests and questions about different finishes, like rum casks, for example. Rum is not, that's not something that's used in Town Branch, presumably either. Rum casks, no. Right?
We have a rum that's been finished in Town Branch. We have a rum, so I won't tell you loads of the story, but we have a rum that's been finished in bourbon barrels in Town Branch. A Caribbean rum that's been finished in bourbon barrels. Even, actually, this is one, I love this. I know it's an Irish whiskey.
I'll give you a pass.
This one here, the Town Branch that we brought out last year, a special edition. It's a 9-year-old. There was only 9 barrels used. It was 9-year-old, finished for 9 months in sherry casks, and there was only 9 barrels of it. This is amazing. So we do have access to some unusually used barrels from our sister distillery in Town Branch as well. They've been at it a little bit longer than ourselves, so there is access to it, and that's a delicious example of one.
So I'll leave you one last question, Conor, because I know it is now 1:10 in the morning, and there's a light on in a pub in Cork somewhere, and you have a family to go home to. But the last question is,
they're in bed, hopefully.
they should be. Are there any future releases from Town Branch that you want to share? I know it's not Irish whiskey, but it's a very big connection.
Yep. Well, Town Branch itself has just kind of repackaged a lot of their products into the square decanter bottle that the Town Branch bourbon was synonymous with. So our rye has gone moving into it, and our single malt is going into it. So our malt that we started off with, which would have been our Pearse Lyons Reserve, funny you asked, you didn't know I had this bottle here. So this is our Pearse Lyons Reserve from Kentucky. This is our no age statement single malt. We have a single malt that is a little bit older, but this year we're going to have a very old, probably for North America, could be the oldest age statement single malt appear on the market this year at some stage, which is a very interesting and a very, very exciting project for the guys to be able to bring out on their side of things.
There's a massive range of spirits across the Irish and the American distilleries, isn't there? I mean, from the blends, single malts, bourbons. There's such a range that you couldn't put your finger and say, well, we're known for just this one thing.
No, and I suppose, well, there's a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of diversity in bourbon. You know, to be a bourbon, it has to be a minimum of 51% corn, virgin oak barrels, and away you go. Some people can use lots of wheat, some people use lots of corn, some people use malt. There's a great flexibility in the USA, and I suppose that it's great flexibility, but also there's very good strict laws in the USA that are to be admired as well for bourbon production. And
if it wasn't for those strict laws, we might not get all those lovely barrels over to Ireland and Scotland.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'll leave you this. Promise is the last comment here. This is from Stephen McGuinness.
Yes.
He just said that there's a cask of Pearse Lyons single malt from Town Branch maturing in Anima Negra wine casks in Ireland. And when he worked for Celtic Whiskey Shop, they filled it out.
I know of it.
Okay.
I'm very excited about that as well.
Okay.
You're probably one of the handful of people that know of that existence. All right. Yeah.
Stephen knows of the existence of lots of different things. He's
Stephen probably knows what you have under your bed without you knowing it. Stephen knows everything. He's an oracle.
So listen, Conor, you've been unbelievably generous with your time late at night on a Good Friday in Ireland, locked away in the pub. We won't declare your location, but if there's a crowd waiting for you outside the pub when you leave, it's not my fault. Don't blame us. Thanks a million for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, Barry. And I suppose
absolutely
these days, more than any other times, it's probably a good time to raise a glass and say sláinte, because, as you know, sláinte means health, and these days health is everything. So sláinte, and till the next time we meet.
Thanks a million. We'll chat to you again soon. Thanks a million, Conor. That was Conor Ryan joining us all the way from Cork in a secret location in Kinsale in County Cork. Small town on the coast there. So thanks a million to Conor for joining us. So we're going to stick around and keep drinking and keep chatting and keep telling a few stories and giving you all somewhere to go on a Good Friday. Not that you had anywhere else to go, unfortunately, but a reminder that we are in a lock-in. We're locked into the virtual pub here tonight, and we're going to move on next to a Redbreast small batch. I see Billy Lighton is still on the live stream here. He might raise a glass with us. But the next one we're going to taste is Redbreast small batch that was released last year in the United States, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And this is batch number D, which gives a good influence of a good showcase of the sherry influence of the barrels on the whiskey. So we're going to taste that now in a second. So MP asks which batch this is. This is batch D. I know, MP, you've got, I think, all of these yourself, which is fantastic. Maybe you'll pull out batch D. I'm getting great feedback on the batch D when I've shared it. We find a good glass for it here. But let me know what you've moved on to, what you're drinking. Cassandra says that was fantastic. Thanks for that. Yeah, all thanks go to Conor. It's nice to have somebody to talk on these and bring somebody in. The challenge, of course, is the time difference. Talking to people in Ireland, I'm 8 hours behind Ireland, so it's a little bit of a challenge getting to talk to people this late where we can also join from the east and west coast. But it's great to talk to Conor. He's an absolute oracle of knowledge on the Irish whiskey industry and just spirits generally. He's got a great pub that we won't talk about because he's inside it right now, and he's a great cocktail man as well. Let me see, what are you all drinking there? MP says Batch D of Redbreast is his favourite. I'm going to put the bottle back up here. I love Batch D as well. Greg is moving on to the Black Barrel. Good man. What else have we got? Jessica's joining us from Las Vegas. Great to see you again, Jessica. What else have we got? Joe Moore says it's Good Friday and the pub in Catholic Ireland. Yeah, all times are changing. We're in different times now, aren't we? All right. Wayne is having a Bushmills Steamship bourbon finish. Great stuff. And Jeff, I saw you commented this earlier as well. You got your Tua glasses today. They're amazing. And I'm thinking I'll need to retire my Glencairns. That's the way to think. The Irish are taking over. Out with the Scotch, the whiskey and the glasses, and in with the Irish, which is fantastic. Rick is drinking his Green Spot. Good man, Rick. Rick bought his first bottles of Irish whiskey ever last week. He bought a bottle of Green Spot and a bottle of Redbreast 12-year-old. I'm delighted to see that you're enjoying those. And Jeff, who has all the best Redbreasts, it seems, he's moving on to his Redbreast All Sherry, which must be one of the single cask releases that came out over the last year or two. Michael hasn't yet tried the small batches, but he's hoping to get his hands on some soon. And Billy, the man who who is responsible for blending our wonderful Redbreast, is moved on to Redbreast Listowel edition, which is a fantastic Redbreast, the only Redbreast in the series that doesn't have an age statement on it, and is a wonderful sherry, and kind of a sherry influence from the bodegas Listowel, and an homage to them. Let me see. Dan says he's drinking Guinness. Good man. Can't beat that. And then a glorious glass of Bushmills to follow very soon. So if anyone's got any of these Redbreast small batches, feel free to join along as well. I was lucky enough to spend a little bit of time in Boston last year with Billy and Dave McCabe, assistant blender, as they released and launched these whiskies into the US market. A very small release. So we talked about this on a stream during the week, myself and Omar from That Stram Good. We talked about these because we tasted the Batch D, and we were trying to figure out how many bottles were released, and it's kind of tough to get an exact number, but we think we landed on around about 3,000 bottles in total, 4 different batches, batch A to D, 11 different labels, just to add a little bit of complexity to it, for different retailers and bars and hotels that themselves purchased these casks to be released. So 11 labels, 4 batches, 3,000 bottles, and each of the batches is a slightly different profile to it, and a slightly different representation of the Redbreast profile itself. Carry Out Off License is joining us, John Fleming down there, carrying on from our halfpenny whiskey conversation. He's putting in the plug here saying that it's on promotion down in Killarney now at €28.99. Right, you didn't pay for that ad there now, John. We'll put it up anyway. $28.99 for halfpenny whiskey down there in Killarney if you're in Ireland. Let me see. Joe Moore says you won't be disappointed. I'm not sure which whiskey you're referring to there, Joe. Let me see. And Richard says Batch D was the one he ended up with the least of. Is that because you drank most of it, or is it that you bought more of the other ones, Richard? I know you're the man who transported yourself all the way across America, chasing the different batches, flying and driving. Good man yourself. And Gary's drinking Black Barrel and might open your Redbreast 21. Well, look, we are in a lock-in. We're locked into the virtual pub. We're sampling a few whiskies, telling a few stories, having a bit of crack. If anybody's got any questions about Redbreast, about small batch, that we might press Billy on, or we might try and answer ourselves if Billy has to go to bed, which we will understand, feel free to type your questions in there. We're going out on Facebook and YouTube. These live streams now, we've been doing them every week, sometimes multiple times a week, and they're picking up a bit of steam. Feel free to invite your friends. Share this with friends and family who you want to share a drink with, or who you think would get a bit of kick out of learning a little bit about Irish whiskey. I'm going to bring on more people to chat with me on these live streams, but we're also going to do a weekly focus on a weekly podcast, so an audio podcast for Stories and Sips. I know in the past we've done a lot of video, but we're going to focus as much as we can on audio now as well to complement these live streams, a little bit easier to produce, and also something that we think we can do a little bit more consistently. So MP says that his samples of Batch D are gone, but he'll join us with a B. So I'm going to have a little nose of this. Look at the color of this whiskey. Isn't that beautiful? Rich, dark color imparted from the ex-Oloroso sherry barrels. This is a 14-year-old whiskey, bottled at cask strength. This one particularly, the batch D, was 58.9% cask strength whiskey. Tremendous value whiskey. I would love to see more like this available at that age and at that price point. When this was released, it was just $99 for a 14-year-old cask strength Redbreast, which is around the same price that you'll find the 12-year-old cask strength in many places. So a remarkably affordable, comparatively affordable Redbreast, which is fantastic. Shane Moore is also drinking. He says he's drinking Billy's Redbreast small batch, which is great. Shane joining us from Cleveland, Ohio as well. And Gockel, our friend in Germany, is saying good night to us and stay safe. Gockel, thanks for joining us. Gockel tunes in every week on YouTube. Is a great whiskey man. Him and his wife have come over to Ireland many times and have seen more Irish whiskey distilleries than many of us combined, I think. He's a great Irish whiskey drinker. So good to see you, Gockel. Thanks for dropping in. Shane was out pan frying. He was out fishing on Lake Erie last week, and now he's pan frying his walleye fish at 8:20 at night. He's steaming, pan frying fish. A lovely smell of fish in your house now tonight. But the batch D will go lovely with anything you cook there, I'd say. Oh, the nose on this is incredible. This nutty, dry, nuttiness, dark, rich kind of raisins, figs on the nose, and then it's the kind of whiskey you leave for a bit to just. It needs to think about the world. It needs to sit in the glass and just, it is pondering the world as we ponder the whiskey. And then when we finally put it to our lips, the unmistakable sherry contribution, the dry nuttiness. There's a thickness, a creamy spiciness, a typical Redbreast spiciness, but there is such rich, dark fruits, oak, the wood, vanillin contribution is sensational, and a decent length to it too. Again, 58.9%. I'm not adding any water to it, or well, I haven't historically. You know, I might do it tonight as a little bit of an experiment. JJ's moving on to Redbreast cask strength himself. The cork popping is always a pleasure to hear. It is, isn't it, JJ? We maybe didn't do enough of that. That noise. I always say that's the sound of like an enjoyable Monday morning, isn't it? Right. So we're going to add a drop of water to this, and I'm going to do it. I washed my hands, so I'm going to do this the way that Ger Buckley, the master cooper down in Middleton Distillery, says. He puts his fingers into his glass of water and then drips them into his whiskey. So we're going to put a couple of fingers in there and then drip a couple of drops of water into the whiskey to see if that changes it a little bit. So even the small little drops of water now definitely soften it up a little bit. Going to let that sit there and breathe a little bit. So Dan's got a good question about glasses, about whiskey glasses. Can you talk about the type of glass you use and why one might be better than another? Well, I am no expert, Dan, but I'll tell you what I like, and I'll show you the types of glasses that I have. I was using the Tua glass earlier, which is the Irish whiskey glass, which came out a couple of years ago. This is a kind of Ireland's answer to the Glencairn glass. It can lie on its side because the base is a pyramid, as you can see here. So you could lie it quite easily with a measure of whiskey on its side and it'll look lovely on the table. You can impress all your friends and your family. What's lovely about this glass as opposed to a Glencairn is that you can put your nose into it. The Glencairn, I have trouble sticking my big schnoz into. This one, you can put your nose into it and you can get deep into the glass. Also, it's got a wider, it does have a wider rim on that, so it's kind of a flared rim. So the alcohols, the ethanols are pushed not directly into your nasal passages, but out around the nose. So it allows you to get into that whiskey a little bit more. And also, it's a more of a bulbous glass. Like there's more surface area. It's a larger glass. So when you can swish your whiskey around the glass, it's exposing more of the glass to the surface area. It's exposing more of the whiskey to the surface area and more of the whiskey to the air. And that little bit of oxygen, as Connor was talking about, can always contribute favorably to the whiskey. There's no wrong way to drink whiskey. It's just the more academic you get, the more these things are important. Like, for example, here I'm drinking with a rocks glass with I have a lovely set of glasses here that I like holding. They're kind of got a nice dimpled side to them, dimpled design that I just like holding. Now, I'm probably losing some of the academic aspects of whiskey by having a rocks glass. There's no rocks in it, of course. But it's a matter of preference. Whether you use a Glencairn or a rocks glass, it's really a matter of personal preference. But I'm not an expert to be able to talk about the chemical changes that happen. But Rosie, who is behind Rosie Goswell, who is the founder of Tua Glass, I heard her recently speak about. She's a chemist or an engineer by background, and she talks about the chemical changes that happen with whiskey and how that glass shape contributes to the changes. So yeah, if you can get hold of a Tua glass, I recommend adding it to your shelves. Damien says he needs to get hold of one of those. JJ asks if that's a Stories and Sips glass. No, it's not. It's a regular Tua glass. I was about to get some Stories and Sips glasses made up, but unfortunately the Tua factory is closed down temporarily right now because of the shutdown, because of workers being quarantined. So they're not actually producing any more glasses at the moment. But I'm hoping that when they do fire back up again, we can get some Stories and Sips glasses and kind of give those away as giveaways on tastings like this as well, which would be a bit of crack. Billy enjoyed Connor's talk, as did I, Billy. Connor is a wealth of knowledge on whiskey, and it's great to have him be lucky enough to have him participate. We'll do more like that. So let me see. Richard says that if you're ever in Ireland, he believes that Roe & Co has a beautiful gold-rimmed Tua glass. I think it's copper. Actually, I think Roe & Co has a copper. It looks gold, but it's actually a copper rim, and they're one of the only Tua glasses that has a copper rim, which is to honor the copper, the copper color, that oxidized copper color that is emblematic of Roe & Co. But yeah, they have a nice glass as well. And let me see. Joe asks if we could get Rosie on one of these weeks to explain the significance of the Tua glass. Yeah, that's a good idea. If Rosie's up this late at night, we can absolutely have her on to talk about the Tua glass and what it means. It is a uniquely Irish glass. All right, let me have another sip of this. Yeah, Tim says that it's a copper rim on the Roe & Co glass, which is really nice. So how many weeks are we now into this quarantine, into this lockdown? It seems like it's never going to end. I know that Ireland has just had it announced that there'll be another further 3 weeks of lockdown, which I know is going to affect many, including my family back in Ireland. My parents are in their 70s, so they're cocooned away. And can't go out, and so having deliveries made to them. So it's definitely a tough time. So I'm really relying on things like this, like technology, to be able to connect virtually. And I know it's how we've been doing our get-togethers over the last few weeks, and I found it very helpful. And I know that others are finding it helpful to connect in person or kind of virtually in person with people as well, so we at least see other human faces. For those who joined there in the last few minutes, we did a great tasting last night, actually working with the Jameson, Ohio team. We did a virtual whiskey tasting on a private link, on a video conference link on Zoom. And we had 150 people turn up, register and turn up. So we had 150 faces on the screen. So everybody was able to raise their glass at the same time and toast each other, which was incredible to see so many people coming together for Irish whiskey and community and see each other and connect. And it's remarkable how much, while so much has been taken away from us in this time, how much in other ways we've been brought together. I never had that many people on a virtual tasting, or never even did a virtual tasting before. So that's one of the pluses, is that we're connecting in new ways like never before. And maybe many of us will never or will continue on connecting virtually as we go forward as well. Let me see, what else have we, what other comments have you got here? Greg said that was a great event last night. Greg, thanks for joining in. That was a lot of fun. We went on for 2 hours talking about 4 different Jamesons. We talked about Jameson Black Barrel, Jameson Cold Brew, Jameson Caskmate Stout Edition, and the Jameson 18-year-old, which was a fantastic lineup and a great way to spend a Thursday night. Garrett says that thankfully the weather in Ireland is good at the moment. It's definitely helping. Yeah, it's no joke, is it? Being locked away, being sequestered and isolated from the things we're so used to doing. But I know the Irish, well used to a lock-in, are making the most of it and doing what they can. Siobhan has her Tua glass to hand tonight, a great Irish product it is. Rosie has created a great company and a great glass. I'm proud to use it wherever I can and try and get bars in America to get hold of it. But I heard her mention recently on a podcast interview that bars are afraid to buy the glass because they're so good, that they're afraid that as soon as they serve a whiskey in the Tua glass, it'll find its way into somebody's pocket or into somebody's bag, and it'll be away out the door as fast as they ordered the whiskey. So that is the danger. When you make something so nice, it becomes very thievable, very stealable, which is the sad thing. So yeah, we had great crack last night for sure. But look, this Redbreast small batch is a beautiful whiskey. I don't know if anyone's ever tried the batch D. I wish there was more of them available. I'd love to see more of these coming out. I did see some labels teasing at something similar recently. I don't have any details on it. I'm not going to push Billy on it or put him on the spot, but it'd be great to see more of these small batch releases coming to the United States. People have been lamenting in America the lack of access to some of those single cask Redbreasts that have been coming out over the past few years, and it's been tough to get them in the United States for various reasons. So this has been a great chance to reward the American Redbreast fans with something for themselves. And then of course the Irish complaining and moaning that they can't get these in Ireland, but it's we got to take care of everybody eventually, don't we? Andrew asks if we'll be keeping this going, these virtual tastings remaining alive when the lockdown lifts. 100%, Andrew. This is not going away. I'm planning on this being a Friday night thing in perpetuity. In fact, we started this, the first one, on St. Patrick's Day, which was before, I think, the full lockdown was in place. It was just about to be locked down, I think, or it may have just come, it was just maybe the day before because all the pubs were closed, weren't they? But I had planned to do this before lockdown started. I thought this would be a good way to bring people together. And yeah, the plan is to do a lot more of these, as many as we can, and bring in more people to talk about whiskeys. I'm trying to showcase young brands. Next week, you're going to want to tune in because we're going to do something really special next week. So it's no secret that I'm not a fan of peated whiskies. I've never taken to them, unlike Mrs. Stories and Sips, who's over there baking a cake. I've never taken to peated whiskey, but I'm up for the challenge of trying to be won over and trying to be convinced. So next week on the live stream, Friday night, 4 o'clock Pacific time, 7 o'clock Eastern, we're going to bring on Dahi O'Connell. And Dahi is the whiskey merchant. His company is called W.D. O'Connell. And Dahi launched his company in the last 12 months. And one of his whiskey products is called Bill Phil. And it is a peated Irish whiskey, a peated single malt, a young peated single malt. And I've given Dahi the challenge. I've given him the challenge of trying to convince me or convert me to the joys of peated whiskey, peated Irish whiskey, any peated whiskey really. So he's going to try. I've got a bottle of the Bill Phil on standby, and he has assured me that if he can't convince me of the joys and the pleasures of peated whiskey, nobody can. And I'm up for the challenge because I know so many people absolutely love peated whiskeys. And I know that there's a huge chance that the only reason that I don't like peated whiskey is because I don't know enough about it. I don't know what I should be tasting. I don't know why I should be tasting certain things versus others. Dahi's going to help. And Dahi's accepted the challenge. So tune in next week for more of that. So yeah, the goal is to bring on other smaller whiskey brands, whiskey makers, whiskey merchants, whiskey bonders, whiskey companies to talk and have the crack and just introduce them to an American audience. And as distilleries and whiskey brands transition back from making hand sanitizer to making more whiskeys, we'll be able to share news that happens every week in the whiskey world on these live streams as well. So the goal will be over time, we kick this off with the news of what's been happening in Irish whiskey that week. We'll take questions. We'll bring in a guest. We'll share a whiskey together. We'll let people know what whiskeys we're going to drink in advance. Encourage you to get the whiskeys yourself and just hang out every Friday night. It's something that I'm really enjoying. And even if nobody showed up, I'd probably still do it. So hopefully more of you will join in and we'll get a bit of a crowd going. Connor asks if I'd consider doing one of these on Zoom. It would be great to see all the drinking buddies from the last few weeks. I'm definitely open to doing that. It's a little bit more of a challenge to get everyone registered. Not too much of a challenge, to be honest. The beauty of Facebook and YouTube, of course, is that most people have Facebook or YouTube accounts and they're able to log on. But you're right, seeing people's faces is a good idea. So maybe we'll think about that. That's what I did last night with the Jameson event. We're going to do another one later, actually on Thursday, upcoming Thursday for residents of Ohio. Only for Ohio residents, sadly. We're just working with the Ohio Powers team. We're going to do a Powers virtual tasting on Zoom. I think we've got about 40 people registered for that already. We'll probably get to about 100 people who will attend that through Zoom. So we'll see all their faces. So that would be a good thing to look into, Connor. We'll try and figure out if we can do that. Billy had a point where I mentioned the US Redbreast fans who've been rewarded with this small batch in the last few months. The US Redbreast fans will not be forgotten. You must read between the lines whenever Billy puts a comment up here, because Billy knows more than all of us about what's coming and what's on the horizon. And I believe him when he says the US Redbreast fans will not be forgotten. That's fantastic news, Billy. Feel free to message me privately, anything that you know, and I promise I won't tell anybody. But I'd love to know what's coming to the US. Chris Hennessy says Dahi O'Connell, woohoo. Yeah, Chris helps out with Dahi, and Dahi is the man who's going to be convincing and converting me to peated whiskey, or he's going to send me running very quickly in the other direction. Quiveen says he's never been into peat, but Dahi converted him. Absolutely, 100%. So I know Stacey, who may be on the line here. Stacey's a great supporter of Irish whiskey, has come to my tastings and attends my virtual tastings. Stacey is a fan, and Stacey and her husband are fans of peated whiskey as well. So I think you'll be excited to hear more from Dahi as well. And Kelly is registered for Thursday for the Powers tasting. We're going to do the virtual tasting. Fantastic. You're shopping this weekend. It was fantastic last night to see people sending me pictures of the whiskies, the Jamesons that they had bought prior to the tasting. And they had 4 whiskies lined up, ready to go. So that by the time we started the tasting, there they were, ready in their own homes, which is a remarkably different way to do a virtual, or to do a tasting, isn't it? Virtually. But the fact that we all can drink the same whiskies, of course, is a great thing. Richard, who is a huge Redbreast fan, says, "God bless Billy Lighton." I think we'd all say hear to that. Let me see. Paul says you definitely need to get your hands on a turtleneck. Yeah, lots of talk about my turtleneck on the comments. This is the signature Stories and Sips costume or uniform. You have to have something to stand out. The turtleneck is what does it for me, because God knows I haven't got the whiskey knowledge to stand out, but at least I have the turtleneck that can support me. Wayne Sloan says he's going to get his hands on a Bill Phil for next week. Yeah, if anyone's got any peated whiskey, be it Scotch or Irish, Connemara or Bill Phil, even better if you can get your hands on it from Celtic Whiskey Shop or from Irish Malts. It'll be a great session, I think. I'm dubious at best, and I am doubtful as to Dahi's abilities to convince me that peated whiskey can replace any of my current loves like Redbreast or pot still whiskey, any other pot still whiskey. But look, it doesn't have to replace them, I suppose. It can complement them, and there can be a day and a time for it. Mrs. Stories and Sips is a huge Connemara fan. When we first met, she was sipping on a Connemara Irish whiskey, and still I dated her. Can you imagine? And now we're married. Marshall says he doesn't own a turtleneck. Well, we might have to institute a rule going forward that to attend the virtual tastings, you must wear a turtleneck. Maybe we need a branded Stories and Sips turtleneck. That'll be the next one. Jessica says she's not a big peated fan, so she wants to be converted. So this is a great opportunity for Dahi is a fellow Cork man as well. We're bringing on all the Cork men to convince us of the joys of their whiskies. Conor Ryan tonight, Dahi O'Connell next week to talk about the whiskies that they're representing. No better men than Cork men to convince everybody that the thing that they're supporting is the thing that everybody else should support. So Dahi's going to be a great man for that. Tim McKee asks me, Barry, didn't I try the Chosen at the event? So the Chosen is a peated whiskey that was released by J.J. Curry last year, and at the time was the most expensive Irish whiskey ever released. It was a 26-year-old slightly peated whiskey that was released by JJ Curry. And I attended the event at the launch of that, and I tried it. And Tim, I didn't care for it because I don't like peated whiskey. So I told Louise, who is the founder of JJ Curry, that I said, nothing against your whiskey, and I'm sure it's fantastic, but as a non-peated drinker, it's wasted on me, and please give this to somebody who'll enjoy it. So I'm open to it. Stephen says, Mrs. Sips is a lady with class drinking Connemara. Now, he also represents Connemara, but I'm going to take the first bit of that is the right compliment, that Mrs. Sips is a lady. She is indeed. Sheng Yang, a great Irish whiskey fan, Irish whiskey supporter. Connemara 12-year-old single malt is fantastic, very rich and rounded. Again, all these are lost to me right now. I'm going to believe you all and trust you that these are great whiskies. And I don't know if it's something that develops over time, your palate for these styles of whiskey or not. When I first started drinking Irish whiskey, Black Barrel, Jameson Black Barrel was my go-to. And my palate, even a few years ago, very few years ago now, 3-4 years ago, wasn't even ready for Redbreast. At the time, it felt too complex, too spicy, and my palate wasn't ready. It took a little bit of drinking, took a little bit of time, and then eventually Redbreast became my go-to. So maybe it happens with peated. Isn't it a wonderful opportunity for me to present myself to somebody who has a peated whiskey and say, convince me, convert me, and we'll see what he can do. Wayne reckons that if I get converted to peated whiskey, Mrs. Sips will have to lock up her peated whiskey. All her peated whiskey is long gone. It's drained. We have to get some more. Actually, we have the bottle of Bill Phil. Would you mind passing me out that bottle, love? I think it's in the, where did I put it? It's that white one, the Bill Phil. Yeah, thanks. We'll have a look at this bottle here. This is the whiskey that we're going to drink next week, Bill Phil. We'll put it up on the screen here. Single malt Irish whiskey. Only 600 bottles of the Bill Phil were released in this batch. Procured by Dahi O'Connell. Beautiful bottle, lovely, elegant, simple design, nice label quality as well. You see the kind of, let me see if I can hold it up, get the quality of that label. Beautiful. So yeah, we're gonna try this next week. But yeah, lots of people commenting on Cork people. We think that Cork is the capital. Meath is the original capital, apparently. Derek Carr reckons. No, Cork is the only capital. That's all you need to know. Yeah, Cuivine has it right. Another great Cork man, just in case any of our American friends are unaware, Cork is the capital of the Republic of Ireland. So we think. I always reckon that Cork is to Ireland what Texas is to America. Everyone in Texas thinks that Texas is a republic and is a country, and we think the same in Cork. I should be wearing my People's Republic of Cork T-shirt for the next tasting to fly the Cork banner. Joe says those of us who grew up in the Royal County would disagree with Cork being the capital. You can disagree all you want, but Cork, see, look, my Cork accent's even coming out now as I talk about it. Cork is the real capital. There's no way around it. It's as simple as that. Mark says that Bill Phil is, chopping up my glasses there. Bill Phil is a beautiful drop. Looking forward to next week. Yeah, this is going to be a great session because I don't know, has anyone been converted to peated whiskey live on a live stream? We're going to break new records, which will be great. So I'm still working my way through the Redbreast small batch here. Let me see. Jeff asks, what is the Bill Phil peat source? So this is sourced from the Great Northern Distillery in Dundalk, in County Louth. And the peated malt, the malt is peated in Scotland, to the best of my knowledge. Maltsters in Ireland still aren't geared up for drying their malt using peat. So it's a dry heat that we use to dry our malt out. But in Scotland, of course, they're far more prepared for it. Ireland has a strong history and legacy of peated whiskey, but that died out over the past 100 years or so, and we're now finding ourselves in a position where we have to get our peated malt from Scotland, but that will change over time. In fact, there was a peated malt released from the Midleton Distillery earlier this year in late February, early March, to much acclaim, and the fact that it was peated went under the radar, I think, for a little bit. That was the Midleton Silent Distillery single malt, the oldest Irish whiskey Well, one of the oldest Irish whiskies ever released. There is a couple of older, but it's the oldest series of Irish whiskies that will ever be released. They started with their Chapter 1 45-year-old whiskey, and that's from the old Middleton Distillery, which is now a silent distillery. And that's a peated single malt, one of the last distillates, or one of the last distillations to go through the old Middleton Distillery at the hands of Max Crockett, the father of Barry Crockett, the famed master distiller emeritus at Middleton. So they released a peated single malt, which was an experimental single malt, which never, I don't think, saw the light of day at the time. But that was put away in barrels. That's now finding its way into very expensive bottles of whiskey, 35,000 euros a bottle, limited release, 44 bottles in Chapter 1. And then next year we'll have Chapter 2, which will be 46 years old. The following year, 47-year-old, 48-year-old, 49-year-old. And then in 2025, which is the 200th anniversary of the old Middleton Distillery's founding in 1825, they'll release a 50-year-old whiskey. So I don't know if all of those whiskies are peated. I don't know if all of those whiskies are single malts. I don't know what they are. We've yet to find out. A lot of secrecy around it, but there is a history of peated whiskies in Ireland. Stephen says that, in fairness, one of the best whiskies he tried last year was a 3-year-old peated Great Northern whiskey bottled under the Celtic Casks range. It was simply perfection. Hard to believe it's only 3 years. So I've heard that a lot as well, that despite this being a very young whiskey, that it has a remarkable flavor profile. And Dahi messaged me earlier, and he mentioned that there's a light sweetness to this that allows us to understand and appreciate the floral qualities of the distillate, of the new make spirit that went into this to create this whiskey, which I'm really interested to try. I haven't even cracked it yet because I have no interest in peated whiskey, but I have to crack it to get my interest next week. But it's true. I've heard that from a few people that this young whiskey is really good. Tim says that, 50-year-old will be out in 2025. So Chris, in with the details. Here we go. First fill bourbon cask. You can count on Chris to have the details of every whiskey, Irish whiskey, known to man, woman, and child. He can tell you who bottled it, who put it into the barrel, how many barrels it was in. He's talking about Bill Phil, first fill bourbon cask, triple distilled Great Northern Distillery, peated single malt, and decided to be bottled at 47.55% to showcase the distillate, malt intertwining with the smoke and sweetness of the cask. That's great. That's great to know. Chris, tell us, if you wouldn't mind, when you say 47.5% to showcase the distillate, if it had been a higher cask, closer to cask strength, would that have hidden the distillate, or you're saying that would showcase the distillate? Help us understand that, or help me understand that a little more. That would be great. So Derek Carr is having a drop of Killowen rum finish at the moment. Lovely drop indeed. Another great independent distillery. We'll try and have Brendan, who runs that distillery, on here as well. Damien mentions that there's Cork and not Cork. That's right. Whenever I have tasting mats for the tastings over here in the States, I'll have a map of Ireland, and there'll be Cork. There'll only be 2 place names on it, Cork and not Cork. And that's right. That's all we need to know. So all my American friends, you don't need to know anything else about Ireland except that there's Cork and there's not Cork. We need the Up Cork sombrero. Garrett, you get me the Up Cork sombrero. Ship it to me over here, and I'll wear that for the next tasting, the next live stream that we'll do. Great stuff. So Paul Kennedy's off to bed. Paul, thanks for joining us. Good man. It's late in Ireland. It's been a blast. Great to have you. We'll spend another few minutes here sipping on these whiskies, as long as you'll join me. So anybody have any knowledge of upcoming whiskey releases or distilleries that they're excited about? Put in the chat there in the comments anything that you're super excited about. For me, it's Waterford. I mentioned this on the last live stream. What's coming out of Waterford is incredible, and I'm really excited to try the Waterford whiskies. And for those American friends who are joining us, Waterford Distillery is a independently owned distillery in the southeast of Ireland, in Waterford, that is maybe the largest distillery in Ireland that has not ever released a whiskey yet. They have 6.5 warehouses full, floor to ceiling, of whiskey that is aging and has been for the last 3 or 4 years and has not been yet released. The hope was to launch their first whiskey at the end of April. But unfortunately, coronavirus had other plans for whiskey and for distilleries in Ireland. But they're a distillery that I'm really excited about, and they're putting huge emphasis on the quality of the grain, the quality of the barley that's going into their whiskey to make only single malts. That's all they are going to make in Waterford Distillery is single malt only. So I'm really excited to see those. Let me see. Connor is excited about the casks of single pot still he bought from Great Northern and wondering what the hell you're going to do with them in 20 years. Great stuff. We talked about that during the week, didn't we, on our live stream with Omar from That's Dram Good. You were talking about, we were talking about this offer from Celtic Whiskey Shop to buy casks of whiskey through Great Northern Distillery. So Great Northern Distillery, of course, was founded by John Teeling, a remarkable figure and legendary figure in the Irish whiskey world. Great Northern Distillery makes Bill Phil amongst probably hundreds of brands at this stage. They mostly sell their whiskey to third-party bottlers, bonders, and distributors to put their own label on it. I'm excited to see what you do with those whiskies in 20 years too, Connor. Surely we could have a party of some sort to celebrate the 20 years of aging of those whiskies. But I'm glad to see people have snapped up what are great value barrels. When you think you could pay, well, there are distilleries offering casks of whiskey. We're not going to put any distilleries down. We're just going to support distilleries here. But there are some distilleries that are offering casks at very expensive prices. And then there's the Great Northern Distillery that's offering whiskey casks at very affordable, maybe in some cases a third or a quarter of the price of some of the other distilleries. So it pays to shop around. Richard is excited for the next Redbreast Dream Cask, as we all are. My hope, Billy, is that that doesn't get delayed in any way. If there's anything at all, Billy, you can share about whether that's in the affirmative, there will be a release in and around World Whiskey Day, which I think this year falls on May 16th. Is there anything at all that we should know? I'm always going to press you. You might not be able to answer, but I'd love to know if there's anything we should know about the next Redbreast Dream Cask. There have been 2 Redbreast Dream Cask releases over the past 2 years. My understanding is it is a continuing series, 1 per year for the foreseeable future, which is Billy's selection for what makes for the dream cask, that one or a number of casks that best represent the Redbreast range, the Redbreast stock that's been aging in Middleton. So I'm excited to see what could potentially come. It's the highlight of the whiskey year over the past few years. The anticipation is amazing for Redbreast. So I'd love to know if there's anything coming along there. Cuivine is looking forward to the next batch of Proper 12 from Connor's Distillery. What a distiller. Okay, Cuivine, good man yourself. Maureen is looking forward to, you were looking forward to visiting Waterford in June. Who knows, Maureen, if the world can get back tilting on the axis that it should and at the right angle, perhaps that'll happen. The Waterford experience is fantastic. Love what they're doing on there, and hopefully you can get there. Chris answered my question about the peat and about the peated whiskey and about the distillate ABV. So he says that at cask strength, the peat influence is heightened. Citrusy and malt tones change to a more bergamot tea, tannins and sharpness than the lemon drizzle and buttery biscuit sweetness of the chosen 47%. Okay, that's great to know. I'm being educated on my peated whiskies and cask strength. As usual, every time we do these live streams, whiskey experts come out of the woodwork, people like Chris Hennessy and Connor and Billy Lighton and many who have tremendous things to share about whiskey that teach me every time I come on. I am an amateur in the world of whiskey, let me tell you, an amateur palate, an amateur nose, but a sponge for knowledge. So I love hearing from the likes of Chris. Chris has got tremendous knowledge. So that's good to know. At cask strength, the peat influence is heightened. So it's good to get me in at a lower peat influence, start me off small. Lemon drizzle. You can't beat a bit of lemon drizzle. Wayne says that a new bottle just opened too last week, wiped out the last one. Glad you had a backup. Wayne's on the good stuff, which is great. And Jeff toured Waterford a few years ago, which I remember you mentioning it to me. And Rick says he tried to book a not Cork flight on Aer Lingus. They didn't get it. They mustn't have been from Cork, Rick. They mustn't have been from Cork. Richard is trying to figure out how to mule a bottle of the next Dream Cask back to the US. You had to fly to Ireland to meet up with the one you bought. That may not be an option this year with all the travel restrictions. Yeah, it would be fantastic if we were able to get the Dream Cask in the United States. It's we're relying, of course, when we're here on having friends and family who can receive a bottle for us in Ireland if we're lucky enough to be able to secure one. And it would be great to get the Dream Casks into the US, no doubt about it, but they are in limited supply. I know that in the past there's been 800-900 bottles at most have been released, and so that does reduce the ability to supply them to the US. But Richard, I know that you're a man who's going to find a way to get hold of a Dream Cask, just like you found your way to get hold of all of the Redbreast small batches that we're working our way through here, like the Batch D. So Joe Moore is on to his final glass of the night, as am I. Joe is on his Yellow Spot, which is a remarkable whiskey. And my last glass, I'm still working my way through, taking my time on this. I take so long with Redbreast small batch because I don't want it to disappear. I sip it slowly over an hour or two. There's no rush. I'm going to be here all night. So for those of you who are still on the line, and we'll wrap up in a few minutes, who should we bring on to talk about their whiskey? So we'll have you gave me great ideas for the podcast last week. Who would be great to share the screen with, or to give them over the screen to talk about whiskies in Ireland, or maybe there's some US Irish whiskey connections, maybe Irish whiskey representatives in America. But if there's anybody that you think would be a great add-on or great contributor to the conversation, you don't want to be hearing me talking all the time. There's people with far more knowledge than me. But yeah, let me know if there's anybody that you think would be a good addition as well, or who you'd like to hear from. Steve just finished his Black Barrel. Now it's time for the Knot. I've not tried the Knot, which is a liqueur, isn't it? It's an Irish whiskey liqueur, to the best of my knowledge. John says that the Redbreast Batch D is outstanding. It really is. It's Billy, you'd be delighted to hear that when the nose I get on this Batch D is so close to the nose I associate with Redbreast 32-year-old, the first Dream Cask. Now there's maybe a depth of flavor on the nose, or richness to the nose of the 32 that is not in this Batch D, this 14-year-old, understandably. But to me, the profile is very, very similar, and that may be the sherry influence predominantly. But it is I wish I had picked up a few more of these Batch Ds because they're remarkable value altogether. Okay, so here's some great suggestions. Maureen reckons I should get Louise from JJ Corrie on, or the folks at Waterford. I know Louise and I are going to do a podcast together. We are struggling with the time differences in terms of getting people on here. It's a particular challenge. But yes, we're going to have Louise on. The folks at Waterford, I know Ned, head distiller at Waterford, was on our chat earlier tonight, which was great. Delighted to have Ned. I'd love to talk more with Ned, actually. Not only is he a fountain of knowledge, Ned is a gentleman. Ned is one of the kindest souls you'll meet in the Irish whiskey world, and I would enjoy spending time in his company, and it would be a privilege to have him. So I'd like to bring Ned on as well, which would be great. Jeff suggests Bernard Walsh. I think that would be a great conversation. I would love to learn from Bernard Walsh, who is the man behind the Irishman range of Irish whiskies over the years, as well as Writer's Tears, which many of you will be familiar with. So Bernard is a remarkable Irish whiskey figure, and has been a proud, or a fanatical supporter and ambassador of Irish whiskey long before it became popular to host live streams like this on a Friday night. Bernard Walsh was out there long before people were getting thanks for being ambassadors for Irish whiskey. So he would be certainly a great chat. Quiveen reckons Jarlath Watson of Ecklandville would be a very good one to have on. Yeah, Jarlath is a wealth of knowledge as well. And it would be great to have a Northern Irish accent and a Cork accent, and the two of us trying to understand each other on a chat like this. It would make for some viewing, wouldn't it? Richard has a great suggestion. We should get Ger Garland on. So Ger Garland is a brand ambassador, or I think he has a new elevated role within Irish distillers who are responsible for Redbreast and Powers and Jameson and the Spot series, Middleton Very Rare. Ger Garland is a wealth of knowledge, and somebody that I learn something from every minute I'm in his company. And I've had the joy of being at a number of tastings in the Palace Bar in Dublin, where Ger has been sharing the history and the nose and the palate behind the whiskies. So yeah, Ger will be a great one to get. Thanks for that suggestion. Graham Cool, Scottish man, leading distilling at the Dingle Distillery. Graham would be a great conversation to have. Absolutely. We might be able to get Graham on. Good suggestion. Connor suggests somebody from the Dublin Liberties Distillery. Great names in each of their whiskies. Yeah, and that would be a good conversation too. Perhaps with the master distiller from the Dublin Liberties Distillery, who formerly came from Bushmills. Connor, who has not gone to bed. Connor is still up. It's now 2 o'clock in the morning, and Connor is refusing to go to bed. He's probably still locked in the pub. Probably better off. We should bring Stephen McGuinness on and make a weekend out of it. Stephen, if you're open to it, we'll have you on. Just let me know. Siobhan reckons we should bring on King Jarlath. Would love to grill him for a night. All right, we'll try and get him on. So we'll try and get Jarlath on. Ecklandville Distillery doing wonderful things with grain to glass, with growing the barley in their estate, and have released really interesting sourced whiskies while they're waiting for their own whiskey to age. They're doing remarkable things with cask finishes. Maybe the highlight of my 2019 was their 18-year-old single malt, 18 I believe it was, wasn't it? The Port Morant rum cask finish. Don't typically like rum cask finishes. Loved that single malt. It was like chewing on a bag of sweets. Absolutely delicious. So really love what they do at Ecklandville, and would love to get him on as well. Mark reckons John Teeling would be amazing. John would be, that would be a fantastic conversation that I'd love to learn from John. We'll have to get him to stay up late at night, or we'll. That's where I think the podcast comes into it, where I can do remote interviews and we can release them as podcasts, and then maybe talk about them on the live stream. So maybe release the podcast on a Thursday, and then on a Friday we can talk a little bit about who we've interviewed. And for those of you who've had a chance to listen to the podcast, we can do a little bit of a podcast book club on those we interview. That would be the goal. Quiveen reckons that we should get Chris Hennessy on for a whiskey cocktail masterclass. What do you think, Chris? Would you be up for that? If you would be, the screen is all yours. If you could tell us how to make great cocktails with great Irish whiskey, we'd love to have you. That would be a no-brainer. We'd love to get you on. There's Darren waving at us from down in Waterford. How are you doing, Darren? Good to see you. Chris reckons Michael Carr from Pearse Lyons, Robert Caldwell from Teeling, Gerald from Ecklandville, and Ned Gahan from Waterford would all be great. Absolutely. Greg, this is a great suggestion. I'm absolutely going to reach out to Grace to talk about barley. Grace O'Reilly, who is the agronomist for the Waterford Distillery, her job is to work with the farmers that they contract their barley growing with. And Grace's job is to go around and get to know the farmers, get to understand what they're trying to achieve, help them understand the type of barley that Waterford would like grown, that they believe will make for the greatest single malt whiskey. But Grace is a fantastic knowledge on barley, a farmer's daughter, grew up in the farming world and is now living her dream of working in the farming world with whiskey. So she'd be a great interview, absolutely. John reckons getting Graham from Dingle and Faye on as well. Husband and wife duo who are now in Dingle, living in the distiller's cottage, the distiller's house beside the distillery. They'd be great. Great conversation. Stephen says we should do it in the folk house. Stephen might have blown the lid there on the pub that Connor's hanging out in, that Connor's been hiding in, and I hope he's left it now. The folk house in Kinsale. Yeah, Maureen, that's a great idea. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be lining up these podcasts over the next week and trying to schedule interviews with all these folks. And I'll reach out to you all on Facebook, on the Facebook group, or on Stories and Sips on Instagram or Twitter, and I'll ask you your questions that you'd like me to ask. And that way we'll make sure that all the pressing questions get asked. That would be fantastic. Siobhan reckons we shouldn't have Stephen on because his head is inflated to the point of no return as it is. Well, Siobhan, you might just need bigger doors in the house, and that way, no matter how big his head gets, you'll still be able to get through the door. Well, there's Brendan Carty now from Killowen. Brendan, we're going to have you on. We're going to have to do it. We're going to have to chat together because people need to hear about your approach. You're up there making hand sanitizer at the moment, doing incredible things for frontline workers in Northern Ireland. And so thanks for all you're doing there. But we need to chat about the great things that are happening in Killowen. Brendan has a remarkable approach to whiskey distillation. and using old mash bills and different approaches with direct flame distillation that is really unheard of. So really small micro kind of distilling happening in Killowen Distillery. So that would be great to talk to you, Brendan, over the coming weeks as well. I'll be reaching out to you. And John Quinn or Kevin Piggott from Tullamore. Yeah, absolutely. Tullamore, we sampled some Tullamore 14-year-old during the week. That would be a great conversation to have. I'd love to get John Quinn on or Kevin Piggott. That would be an absolutely great conversation. So maybe we'll see who we can get on the live stream, and then we'll also see who we can get on the podcast. That way we'll have an audio podcast once a week, and we'll have a live stream once a week, and we'll see who we can get on both of these. There'll be no other work done in my house. There'll be no hoovering done. There'll be nothing done. The house will be a mess because I'll be too busy doing live streams and podcasts, and there'll be no money made. Great stuff. That's Brendan committing to it. And Wayne says that he can't wait look forward to Brendan Carty coming on. Well, Brendan, now that I know you stay up this late, we'll get you on the live stream maybe the week after next, if you're open to it, and maybe you can showcase some of your Killowen, and maybe we'll have a drop over here to share as well with you. Tommy Byrne at the Whiskey Academy came up again last week. Somebody else suggested Tommy, so we have word out to request some time with Tommy as well. The Irish Whiskey Academy, for those American friends who aren't familiar, is part of the Middleton campus. The Middleton Distillery has an academy where they bring in bartenders and whiskey fans, and the public can attend courses at the Irish Whiskey Academy over 2 days. They have a great course, and you can gain a deep understanding of whiskey from all stages of production, from growing of the barley to fermentation, the brewing, distillation, maturation, and it's a great chance to kind of get up close to how Middleton make their whiskies. So Tommy would be an absolute wealth of knowledge. So listen, thanks to everyone for hanging out tonight. You've hung in there 2 hours and 6 minutes. These get longer every night. I'm going to nurse my Redbreast small batch D for a bit longer, but I'm going to do so from the comfort of my couch and in the company of Mrs. Sips, who's busy over there with her baking. But thanks everybody for joining in. We're going to reach out to folks to join us on next week's for our podcast and our live streams. Stay tuned next week as Dahi O'Connell tries to convince me that peated whiskey is the future of whiskey. I am very dubious and very doubtful about his abilities, but I'm somewhat open-minded. So I'd love for you to tune in, and if you're interested in peated whiskey or want to be, I think that'll be the one to watch. So thanks everybody, appreciate you all. Shane, Quiveen, MP, Joe, Stephen, Maureen, Wayne, Chris, fair play to you all for joining and for staying up so late in Ireland. I absolutely love doing these, and I'm delighted to spend time in your company. It's a privilege for me. It kicks my weekends off in a fantastic way. So sláinte until we see each other again. Be safe and stay at home.